This is the lecture for Iris Marion Young's chapter Social Difference as a Political Resource, sections 1 through 5. And you can watch this lecture either before or after you do the reading. It's sort of filling out the reading, but it's not preliminary information. So I'm going to talk about this idea that's all throughout her article, but all throughout the chapter, but that's sort of the background of the chapter, which is this is at the very first page. She says, many advocates of a deliberative model of democracy appeal to the Republican ideal of a common good as what distinguishes it from an aggregative model of democracy. To form a deliberative public in this interpretation, citizens must leave aside their parochial concerns of local loyalty and particular affiliation. Deliberative citizens cooperate by looking for what they have in common, seeking similarities among themselves. On this construction of politics and deliberation, there are only two alternatives, which correlate with the distinction between aggregative and deliberative models of democracy. Either people mobilize in self-regarding interest groups that compete for goods without any concern for justice, or citizens engage in rational discussion to identify the policies that unite them in a shared vision of their common interests. So she's saying there are sort of people who advocate for deliberative democracy, and they think, either you have deliberative democracy, which does it in the good sort of way, where people sort of come together to form their ideal of the common good, or you have sort of the bad kind of democracy, where people are just sort of out to get what's best for themselves, and so they group together with like-minded people to sort of vote as a bloc to get their own concerns sort of enacted in government. And the way she describes, the way she sort of breaks down the deliberative model of democracy, she kind of has, she's a deliberative Democrat, but then she also has sort of three kind of competing views of deliberative democracy, which she labels neo-Republican, liberal nationalist, and socialist. And so this is just, I mean, she talks about these in the chapter, but just to fill out these three things a bit with stuff that we've read so far. So this idea of deliberative democracy being a kind of Republican project or neo-Republican project where there's this sort of shared common good that we're looking to sort of find through deliberation and pursue through deliberation. And so it's our job to sort of all group together and commit to this. If that sounds familiar, it's because we've seen it twice so far. So we saw it in Charles Taylor and we saw it in Elizabeth Anderson. So Charles Taylor, remember, thinks that in order for a community to sort of persist and thrive, especially a liberal democratic community, what you need is this sort of like common sentiment, this sort of Republican sentiment where the thought is we're all in this together and we're all sort of sharing a common, political interest. And so it's us together, and I care about us. I care about the political project of us as this group. And he thinks you need that kind of patriotic sentiment in order to have a working democracy in the modern era. And so that's what we could label a sort of Republican or neo-Republican idea. He calls it a Republican ideal specifically. And so if you think about the sorts of things Taylor has in mind, you can maybe group him into the neo-Republican category as the people, one of the sorts of people Marion Young is criticizing here to some extent. And similarly, Anderson, if you remember, Anderson is 100% a deliberative Democrat. She thinks everybody should sort of, the way democracy should work is that everybody should be equal and we should all deliberate together, and it's only in virtue of deliberating that we can reach certain goods. Whether or not she's sort of a neo-Republican in the sense that Young is talking about, I don't know. That's less clear. You'll have to sort of take a look at what Young says about the neo-Republicans and think back to Taylor and think like how close is Anderson to Taylor and how close is Anderson to the neo-Republicans here. We talked a bit, I can't remember if I talked about it in the lecture, but we talked in class a bit about like similarities between Anderson and Taylor. So there's certainly something there, but I don't know how far along Anderson would be in the sort of neo-Republican model. She's definitely a deliberative Democrat of some kind, but remember Young also here is a deliberative Democrat, but Young does not want to see herself as a neo-Republican. She's sort of opposed to them. So much for the neo-Republicans and for deliberative democracy broadly. The other two kinds of deliberative Democrats she's fighting against are the liberal nationalists and the socialists. So liberal nationalists, we haven't seen explicitly really in this class, except Taylor is kind of one of these. He's sort of on the fence between this and neo-republicanism. The idea for Taylor is that maybe you can do neo-republicanism just with a sort of commitment, just with a sort of patriotic commitment to like democratic procedure. He says the United States is sort of an experiment in this sort of thing where like maybe the country can just get by on people really caring about like the law and the Constitution and stuff like that. Like maybe they can just be patriots about free speech and the Bill of Rights and stuff like that. Maybe you can have a society based entirely on that. There are visions of the Indian Constitution and Indian society where the goal is to sort of like, yeah, what we should, our sort of patriotism should be for this shared like constitution and sort of liberal way of life. Like there's nothing else that we have to share as a community that we all have to agree on. We don't have to get everybody to agree on like a religion or anything like this. Rather, what we want to enshrine are these, basic rights and principles that we're governing our society by. And so if you recall what Taylor said about this, he's like, I don't know if this is enough. Maybe, maybe not. It's possible this isn't enough for our society, so we can be sort of 100% neo-Republicans. But then he also leans in the direction of what we might call liberal nationalism, where he suggests, no, maybe the patriotism has to be thicker. Maybe the patriotism also has to include, like a shared history and culture and stuff. And so you can't just be a patriot about, the Indian Constitution or the US Constitution or something. You really have to be a patriot about the United States and all the symbols of that and American culture and stuff. Or you have to be a patriot about, Indian culture and like what exactly would that be? Probably we're going to have to get more specific. And once you get more specific, that starts excluding people. And so the thought is Taylor's like, I don't know if you can get by with just a thin conception, or maybe you need something thicker. And if you need something thicker, if you need some sort of like shared conception of history, which is more than just like, oh, we care about laws and rights, then you're basically what we often call a nationalist because you think, there's some sort of, I have some vision of the nation and the nation is important and I care about the nation and it's got these sort of cultural characteristics. And then, so Young is interested here in the liberal nationalists, which we can probably group Taylor in with. Like he thinks the liberal versus communitarian is another kind of nationalist. He thinks that debate is kind of the wrong way to look at it. But like broadly speaking, Taylor is happy with a lot of the important things in liberalism, which is personal freedom. So maybe we can sort of see Taylor as something of a liberal nationalist. But whether or not Taylor is a liberal nationalist, there are sort of other people who fall into this category who say, look, personal freedom is important, but sort of the way to ensure this, like because people care quite a bit about, whatever culture they were raised in or something, we need to protect cultures in order to protect the freedom of individuals. And so the liberal nationalist says we should promote, self-determination for cultures. Cultures should rule themselves or whatever for the sake of individuals. We're still liberals, but we care about national cultures. So let's protect nations. So those are the liberal nationalists. Then there are socialists. Socialists can also be deliberative Democrats who think we should all sort of, get together and deliberate for the greater good. And in fact, it's hard to imagine being a socialist without thinking that deliberative democracy is probably a good idea at some point. So some socialists have thought like, yeah, maybe we need a dictatorship for a while to get everything going. But kind of the hope, the socialist utopia is that everybody is equal, and you don't usually have a dictatorship when everybody is equal. Usually you have a democracy when everybody is equal, and it would be a sort of deliberative democracy, everybody talking about everything and ruling each other and stuff. So the socialist vision is a deliberative democratic vision, and we haven't read any socialists yet, but we'll get there because we voted for capitalism as one of the other topics, and when we read capitalism, we'll also read some socialism. So specifically Cohen, when we get there to capitalism, we'll see the socialist view of this. So this is just to fill out a bit the kind of opponents that Young has in mind, both past and future, so that we can better understand who is she arguing against in this chapter.